Early in the morning, firefighter George TFA had just finished a grueling 24-hour shift at the fire station. Exhausted but relieved to finally spend time with his daughter, he drove to his grandmother's house to pick up 8-year-old Madison. As they drove home, Madison suddenly, remembering that she had forgotten something important at her mother's apartment. As they approached the townhouse, an unsettling feeling crept over him. A heavy weight settled in his chest as he stepped inside. And in that instant, his world shattered. There, sprawled across the living room floor, lay Shauna's lifeless body. Her face was barely recognizable, bruised, bloodied, beaten beyond comprehension. The brutality was staggering. This documentary will focus on Shauna Ann Castleton, was born on March 13, 1966 in Salt Lake City, Utah, to William and Nancy Castleton. She was the second daughter in a large, bustling household, growing up with her older sister Paula and 5 younger brothers. In 1978, when Shauna was just 12 years old, the family relocated to Pennsylvania due to her father's work. The move was a significant change, but Shauna took it in stride, adapting quickly to her new environment. Just 2 years later, in 1980, the Castletons moved once again, this time to Northern Virginia. By now, Shauna was a young teenager, and such transitions might have been challenging for some, but not for her. What truly set Shauna apart was her personality. She had an effervescent energy that could light up any room, a trait that remained with her throughout her life. People gravitated toward her because of her warm and welcoming presence. At work, she was known for her thoughtful surprises, bringing cupcakes for coworkers' birthdays, leaving little notes of encouragement, and making sure no one ever felt forgotten. Her genuine warmth and kindness left a lasting impression on everyone she met. For someone as dynamic and full of life as Shauna, there was no better city to call home than Las Vegas. At the age of 28, in 1994, she made the bold decision to move to the vibrant desert city in search of opportunity. Initially, she found work in the cosmetics department of Fifth Avenue, a high-end department store. Though she enjoyed working with beauty products and interacting with customers, Shauna soon realized that retail wasn't where her heart lay. She longed for the pulse of Las Vegas nightlife, the energy, the thrill, something more suited to her outgoing nature. It wasn't long before she found her true calling. Shauna secured a position as a cocktail waitress at a newly opened casino, stepping into a world that suited her perfectly. With her dazzling smile, sharp wit, and boundless charm, she quickly became a favorite among both her colleagues and the casino's patrons. Over the next 11 years, she built a solid reputation as one of the most beloved waitresses in the establishment. By the early 2000s, she was making an impressive income, earning over $100,000 annually between salary and tips. Her natural beauty, coupled with her infectious personality, made her a magnet for attention. Men frequently asked her out, hoping to win her over, but Shauna remained selective. She wasn't interested in casual flings. She was holding out for something real. Then, one fateful evening, everything changed. About a year into her job at the casino, Shauna locked eyes with a man across the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and effortlessly handsome, with the kind of presence that turned heads wherever he went. His warm, confident smile caught her attention immediately, and the intensity of his gaze sent a shiver down her spine. His name was George TFA, a firefighter with the Las Vegas Fire Department. From the very beginning, there was something electric between them. Their connection was immediate and undeniable. George was not only physically striking, he had an athletic build, chiseled features, and the kind of strong, steady hands that came with his line of work. But he also had a magnetic personality. His charm was effortless, his laugh deep and reassuring. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had dedicated his life to serving others, risking his own life to save strangers. As Shauna got to know him, she realized he was even more remarkable than he appeared. After graduation, he had attended the prestigious United States Military Academy and later served in the Army Corps of Engineers. He had spent years building schools and water supply systems in impoverished regions, sending the majority of his earnings home to support his mother and his disabled sister. He was selfless, strong, and compassionate, a rare combination that made Shauna fall for him completely. Just a year after their first meeting, Their whirlwind romance culminated in the birth of their daughter, Madison. The arrival of their baby girl was the happiest moment of Shauna's life. From that moment on, her priorities shifted entirely. Motherhood became her greatest joy, and she devoted every free moment to her little one. Because both Shauna and George worked demanding jobs with irregular hours, Madison often stayed with her grandmother. But Shauna never let a moment go to waste. Whenever she picked up her daughter, she showered her with affection, making up for the lost time with endless hugs, bedtime stories, and whispered "I love yous." Every day, she marveled at how lucky she was to have this perfect little family. When Madison turned 3, George and Shauna finally got married in March 2006. The newlyweds held a private wedding ceremony in Hawaii, just a few days after Shauna's 40th birthday. The first few years after the wedding, Shauna and George genuinely appeared content in their marriage. They were devoted to each other, raising their daughter with love and care, and for a while, life seemed to follow the fairy tale script. But as in many stories, happiness has a fragile quality, and it didn't take long for cracks to appear in their seemingly perfect life. The bliss of their early years together gradually gave way to tension and conflict. The shift began after the financial collapse of 2008, when the economic downturn and housing crisis struck them hard. Like so many others, the Tiafes found themselves struggling to stay afloat. They lost a significant amount of money, and with that loss came a change in George, a drastic, unsettling transformation. Once a loving and supportive husband, he became bitter, resentful, and increasingly aggressive. It was as if the man Shauna had once loved so deeply had been replaced by someone unrecognizable. The financial hardship seemed to amplify his worst qualities, turning him into someone filled with jealousy and anger. At first, Shauna tried to be understanding. She knew times were hard and stress was at an all-time high. But what she couldn't ignore was how George's behavior toward her had shifted. She confided in friends that he had become hypercritical, scrutinizing everything she did. It started with small things: disapproving glances at how she arranged the kitchen, irritated sighs when she bought something minor for Madison. But it quickly escalated. He began counting every dollar she spent, making snide remarks about her choices and belittling her efforts at every turn. Then there was the moment that shattered whatever love and respect she still had for him. One evening, as Shauna was getting ready for work, George crossed a line he could never uncross. He called her a woman of ill repute, a degrading insult he hurled at her right in front of their young daughter. Madison, just a child, had watched in stunned silence, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. It was at that moment that Shauna realized the extent of George's resentment. His anger wasn't just about their financial struggles. It was about his own sense of inadequacy. He couldn't handle the fact that his wife was now the primary breadwinner. His wounded pride transformed into an unbearable insecurity, and instead of dealing with it constructively, he took it out on her in the cruelest of ways. As their marriage continued to unravel, George's behavior became increasingly erratic. His actions no longer seemed grounded in logic, but rather in an attempt to assert control. To spite his wife, he formed an unlikely friendship with a homeless drifter, a man who had nowhere to go and nothing to lose. Without consulting Shauna, George invited this stranger onto their property and began hiring him for odd jobs. This man, unkempt, unpredictable, and unsettling, became a looming presence in Shauna's life. She often found herself alone in the house with Madison while the drifter lingered outside, doing chores George had assigned him. Something about him made her skin crawl. His gaze lingered too long, his presence felt invasive, and there was an unspoken menace in his demeanor that set her on edge. Every time she voiced her concerns to George, he dismissed her fears, waving them away as paranoia. It was as if he took pleasure in her discomfort, relishing the fact that she no longer felt safe in her own home. The realization hit her hard. Her husband no longer cared about her well-being. The man who had once vowed to protect her now seemed indifferent to her distress. Shauna had always envisioned a different kind of life. A cozy home filled with warmth, laughter, and love. She had dreamt of a marriage built on mutual respect, of a husband who cherished her, and of a daughter who would grow up surrounded by unwavering parental support. But instead, she found herself trapped in a situation where indifference, resentment, and control had replaced love. The weight of it all became unbearable. As the months passed, hope dwindled. Every attempt at rekindling what they once had was met with cold detachment. By April 2012, Shauna had reached her breaking point. She finally made the painful decision to leave. Though the decision was agonizing, she knew it was the only way to protect herself and her daughter. She agreed to share custody of Madison, hoping that even in separation, George would remain a decent father. And despite everything, a small part of her, a part still clinging to optimism, hoped that perhaps in time they could mend the damage. Shauna even attempted marriage counseling as a last-ditch effort. But it was there, in the counselor's office, that she faced the harsh truth. It was over. The man sitting beside her in those sessions was not the man she had married. He was no longer the kind, passionate firefighter she had once fallen for. That summer, Shauna's life underwent a massive transformation. She channeled her energy into her job, excelling in her career despite the emotional turmoil. She moved into a modest but cozy townhouse in suburban Summerlin, Nevada, just 30 minutes from the casino where she worked. It wasn't the sprawling family home she had once imagined, but it was hers. The townhouse had its own private entrance, a garage, and just enough space for her and Madison to start fresh. She worked tirelessly to turn it into a sanctuary, a home filled with warmth and stability for her daughter. Despite her long work hours and the exhaustion that often accompanied them, she never let her struggles show. She remained the same optimistic, determined woman she had always been. One time, in early September, Shauna finished her casino shift as usual and headed home. Just stepping inside her apartment, Shauna's heart pounded as she immediately sensed something was off. A cold chill ran down her spine as her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything out of place. It was unmistakable. Someone had been there before her. It couldn't even be called a typical burglary. Oddly enough, all her valuable items remained untouched. However, one thing was missing: her wedding ring. That alone was disturbing enough, but the discovery that followed made the situation far more unsettling. As she checked her belongings, she noticed something else was missing: a bottom piece of her swimsuit. But even more bizarre was what had been left behind in its place. A pair of men's boxer shorts, small in size, folded neatly as if deliberately left there for her to find. The entire situation was beyond comprehension. The idea of a stranger sifting through her private possessions, touching her things, and leaving behind this sickening calling card left her shaken. And yet, despite the terror creeping into her bones, she wasn't sure what to do. Reporting it to the police felt almost ridiculous. What would she even say? That someone had stolen a swimsuit bottom and left their underwear behind? It sounded more like a twisted prank than an actual crime. Her natural optimism pushed her to dismiss the incident, convincing herself that it was an isolated event, that nothing worse would happen. And so, despite the deep discomfort festering inside her, Shauna took no further steps to secure her home. She didn't change the locks. She didn't install a security system. She simply carried on, willing herself to believe that it was nothing more than a bizarre one-time intrusion. On the morning of September 29, 2012, just past 3 a.m., casino surveillance cameras captured footage of 46-year-old Shauna Toffey wrapping up her shift. She looked exhausted but content as she left the casino parking lot and got into her car, beginning the 30-minute drive to her suburban Summerlin apartment. She had done this routine hundreds of times before. The moment she parked her car in the garage and stepped out, a predator was waiting. Shauna barely had time to react before she was ambushed on the stairwell leading to her apartment. The attack was savage, unrelenting, and utterly merciless. Her screams were muffled in the dead of night as she fought with every ounce of strength she had. But it wasn't enough. Her attacker ensured there would be no witnesses, no opportunity for survival. It was only after her death was confirmed that the attacker finally disappeared into the shadows. For 6 agonizing hours, her body lay there, undisturbed, unseen, as the world carried on oblivious to the horror that had just unfolded. It wasn't until 9 a.m. that she was finally discovered, and in the most tragic of circumstances. That morning, George Tiafe had finished a grueling 24-hour shift at the fire station and went to pick up their 8-year-old daughter, Madison, from his mother's house. It had been a normal day, just like any other weekend. But as they drove back toward, Madison suddenly remembered she had forgotten something important at her mother's apartment. She asked her father to stop by so she could retrieve it. As George approached the townhouse, something immediately felt wrong. The garage door was slightly ajar. It wasn't locked. A sense of unease settled over him. He went inside, only to be met with a scene of unimaginable horror. Shauna's lifeless body lay sprawled on the living room floor, her face a mangled of blood and bruises. The brutality was staggering. Blood pooled around her, seeping into the carpet, staining everything in its path. Madison let out a piercing scream as George immediately ushered her outside, shielding her from the grisly sight. His hands trembled as he dialed 911, his voice strained with shock and devastation as he reported the gruesome discovery. He told the dispatcher everything he knew, that he hadn't seen his wife in nearly 2 days, and that they had been living separately for months. When paramedics arrived, they confirmed what George already knew. Shauna was dead. There was nothing they could do. The police initially suspected a gunshot wound to the head due to the sheer amount of blood, but closer examination revealed a far more brutal reality. Shauna had been bludgeoned to death, 17 blows to the head, each one crushing, relentless. The fingers on her right hand were broken, evidence that she had desperately tried to shield herself, to fight back. It had been a slow, agonizing death. As investigators began piecing together the timeline, they spoke to neighbors, one of whom reported hearing strange noises around 3:30 a.m. coming from Shauna's apartment. But at the time, he had dismissed it, assuming it was nothing more than the usual late-night activity. He never imagined it was the sound of a woman fighting for her life. The murder sent shockwaves through the Summerlin community. Shauna's colleagues were horrified. Naturally, the first suspect was George. As Shauna's estranged husband, he had both a clear motive and potential opportunity. A messy divorce, unresolved resentment. It all seemed to fit. But as investigators dug deeper, they quickly realized George had an airtight alibi. He had been at the fire station for an entire 24-hour shift, surrounded by multiple colleagues who could vouch for his whereabouts. Investigators officially ruled out George as a suspect, his alibi airtight and supported by multiple witnesses. Shauna's close friends and family revealed a disturbing detail. Someone had broken into her apartment just weeks before her murder. Strangely, nothing of significant value was stolen. The only items missing were her wedding ring and the bottom half of her swimsuit. This revelation shifted the investigation toward a different theory. Was her murder the work of a stalker? Perhaps someone who had become obsessed with her, watching her from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike? Could one of her admirers have developed an unhealthy fixation, turning rejection into rage? Could an unhinged suitor, spurned and humiliated, have decided to take revenge in the most violent way possible? The idea was chilling but plausible. Investigators knew they had to consider every angle, and the pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. The investigation into Shauna Tiafe's tragic death gained momentum at an astonishing pace. Just 48 hours later, police received a phone call. The caller was a man named William Panks, better known as Big Will, a longtime Las Vegas resident with a reputation for knowing the ins and outs of the city's underbelly. He worked as a maintenance master for an apartment complex, but more notably, he was known for his commitment to helping former convicts reintegrate into society. However, nothing could have prepared him for the horrifying confession he was about to hear from a so-called friend. According to Big Will, a man he knew had shown up at his place, brimming with excitement. The man was practically giddy, eager to share what he considered incredible news. As Big Will listened, a cold dread settled in his gut. The visitor, his so-called friend, boasted that the previous night he had sent a woman to the other world. The spoke of the act as if it were a triumphant victory, as though he had accomplished some grand mission. With a twisted grin, he declared that he was now free, that he would leave town and start a new, lavish life. Horrified, Big Will demanded to know what exactly the man had done. The response was chilling. The killer described how he had beaten the woman to death with a hammer, striking her repeatedly until the tool itself snapped in half. Big Will had spent years helping ex-convicts turn their lives around, guiding them toward redemption. But this was beyond redemption. This was a level of evil he could not ignore. When he later saw the news report about a woman brutally murdered in her own home, he knew without a doubt that his so-called friend was responsible. The weight of that knowledge pressed on him until he could no longer remain silent. He picked up the phone and called the police. At first, detectives were skeptical. The story seemed almost too outlandish, too grotesque to be true. But they knew they had no choice but to follow the lead. Big Will provided them with a name: Neil Stevens, a drifter who lived at the outskirts of the city, far from the glittering lights of the Strip, in a makeshift tent at the foot of the hills. Stevens had a criminal record, but nothing that pointed to violence. He had spent years in and out of jail for petty crimes, prohibited substances possession, theft, and minor disturbances. Yet now he was being accused of a brutal, calculated murder. With no known connection between Stevens and Shauna, detectives struggled to piece together a motive. Why would a criminal suddenly target a respected casino worker? What linked their paths? At first glance, it made no sense. But one thing was clear: they needed to find Stevens and search for evidence. Since Big Will didn't know exactly where Stevens was staying, he led police to a grocery store where the drifter often loitered. As fate would have it, detectives didn't have to wait long. By sheer coincidence, they spotted Stevens right outside the store. The moment they saw him, they moved in. Stevens was arrested on the spot for possession of illegal substances, but as officers placed him in custody, his reaction was immediate and volatile. He erupted in anger, screaming that they had the wrong man. He denied everything, his protests growing more desperate by the second. Yet despite his frantic denials, something about him unsettled the detectives. His erratic behavior, the wild look in his eyes, it all pointed to something dark lurking beneath the surface. Still, a burning question remained. Why would a man with no history of violent crime suddenly commit such a savage act? To get answers, investigators knew they needed more than just a gut feeling. They needed hard evidence. And so, while Stevens sat in a holding cell, officers launched an exhaustive search for his temporary dwelling. They brought in a helicopter and an extensive search team to comb through each of the rugged hills and the sprawling foothills of the Rocky Desert, approximately 7 miles from the glimmering cityscape of Las Vegas. It was a grueling effort, but the painstaking search soon paid off. Hidden among the rough terrain, detectives stumbled upon an old, tattered tent, its fabric worn and riddled with patches. A makeshift shelter belonging to none other than Neil Stevens. This grim discovery would set the wheels of justice in motion. Nearby, under a thick bush, investigators unearthed a chilling piece of evidence: pants heavily stained with blood. Forensic analysis later confirmed that the blood belonged to none other than Shauna Tiafe. The grim realization sent a jolt through the investigation team. Inside the tent, amid the stench of neglect and discarded belongings, officers also uncovered a significant clue: a crumpled price tag with a barcode. The tag traced back to a hammer purchased just a day before the crime at a local supermarket, tying Stevens even closer to the brutal murder. Back at police headquarters, detectives confronted Neil Stevens with the damning evidence. Instead of outright denial, the suspect's demeanor changed. Employing an old interrogation technique, detectives played a psychological game, telling Stevens that someone had framed him for the crime. It was a calculated gamble, and it paid off. The vagrant, initially wary, suddenly dropped his guard. Rather than fighting the accusation, he stunned detectives by confessing outright. He admitted that he had, in fact, been the one who attacked Shauna Tiafe. He detailed his horrifying actions with unsettling nonchalance, his words painting a picture of the violent attack. However, one crucial question still loomed over the case. Why? Detectives sensed that Stevens was holding back. The answer to this mystery came when officers conducted a thorough examination of Stevens's mobile phone. In his contact list, among unfamiliar names, was one that stood out: George. The investigators felt an eerie sense of déjà vu. George, Could it really be the same George? The only George they had been focused on since the beginning. The victim's estranged husband? Their suspicions solidified when they cross-referenced the call logs. George's number had appeared repeatedly in Stevens' recent call history. A deeper dive into phone records revealed an even more shocking truth. George and Stevens had contacted each other 87 times in the month leading up to Shauna's murder. This was no coincidence. Their association went back several years. George had found in Stevens the perfect pawn. He used the homeless man for odd jobs around the house, not out of generosity, but as a calculated move to infuriate Shauna. Even after Stevens lost his home and descended into homelessness, George maintained contact with him. He had played a long game, slowly manipulating Stevens into becoming his weapon. The relationship between the two men was a deeply disturbing one. Detectives suspected that Stevens suffered from mental instability, which George had exploited to his advantage. The vagrant had become deeply attached to George, idolizing him, treating him as a savior and closest confidant. Stevens would do anything for George, and George knew it. He had expertly molded the drifter into a willing participant in his deadly scheme. But the final nail in George's coffin came when detectives revisited the hammer's barcode and traced it to a major retail store nearby. Determined to find undeniable proof, they embarked on a painstaking task, scouring through hundreds of hours of security footage. What they found left no room for doubt. There, in crystal-clear surveillance footage, George Tiafe and Neil Stevens could be seen together, casually shopping. The footage captured them selecting a hammer, a ski mask, and black clothing. Meanwhile, back in the interrogation room, Stevens continued to spill his secrets. As he spoke, the true horror of their plan unfolded. George had promised him $600 up front to kill Shauna and assured him there would be more. Several $1,000s once he collected the life insurance payout. The murder had been meticulously planned. George had mapped out every step. They had debated multiple ways to execute the crime, but in the end, they settled on a staged home invasion. It was then that the investigators realized the break-in that had occurred 3 weeks before the murder had not been random at all. It had been a test run, a rehearsal. Stevens had been instructed to enter Shauna's home to familiarize himself with the layout, ensuring he wouldn't make mistakes when the time came for the real attack. George had even given his accomplice permission to steal something, his wife's wedding ring, as a small bonus, something he could pawn for extra cash. Then, after hours of grueling interrogation, Neil Stevens finally agreed to show police where he had buried the murder weapon. The hammer, now broken into 2 jagged pieces, that he had used to bludgeon Shauna Tiafe to death in one of the most horrific crimes the city had seen in years. As he guided police to the desolate location where he had discarded the hammer, Stevens recounted in chilling detail the moments leading up to Shauna's death. With his confession and the recovered murder weapon, police had enough to charge George Tiafe as an accomplice. But instead of moving swiftly to arrest the firefighter, investigators made an unusual move. They reached out to his mother and sister first, informing them that George was now implicated in Shauna's murder. It was the 9th day since Shauna's tragic death when George's family received the devastating news. Overcome with shock, his mother and sister did exactly what detectives had anticipated. They immediately called George. The conversation was brief but impactful, as officers, who had been keeping George under surveillance and monitoring his calls, listened in. They heard his sister's trembling voice telling him that he was now considered guilty of his wife's murder. The effect was instantaneous. Within seconds of hanging up, George Tiafe bolted out of his house, leaped into his truck, and tore out of the driveway at reckless speed. His panicked, erratic driving sent him weaving through traffic, his truck veering dangerously as he sped onto Summerlin Parkway. He pushed the accelerator past 85 miles per hour, his thoughts racing faster than his vehicle. Then, in what police believe was a desperate suicide attempt, he made no effort to slow down, no attempt to swerve or brake. Instead, he plowed straight into a concrete barrier at full speed. By some cruel twist of fate, he survived. Emergency responders arrived at the scene expecting to find a fatality. Yet despite the devastating impact, George had miraculously lived, thanks to the seatbelt he had instinctively fastened. He was rushed to a local hospital where detectives wasted no time. As he lay in his hospital bed, battered but conscious, officers moved in and formally arrested him. When informed of the charges, that he was being accused of orchestrating Shauna's murder, George simply looked up from his hospital bed, eyes blank, and muttered, "Okay." Meanwhile, at the police station, Neil Stevens was officially charged as well. The swift resolution of the case sent waves of relief through Shauna's grieving family. Justice, it seemed, would finally be served. But had George succeeded in his suicide attempt, he would have evaded retribution entirely, a thought that haunted Shauna's loved ones. In the end, fate had intervened, ensuring that he would face the full weight of the law. Over 3 months later, Neil Stevens entered a guilty plea to Shauna's murder. The prosecution, in exchange for his cooperation, agreed not to seek the death penalty, but there was one condition. He had to testify against George. This posed a challenge, as Stevens remained deeply attached to his so-called friend, reluctant to betray the man he had once idolized. However, Stevens was highly impressionable, easily swayed, and the legal team eventually convinced him to cooperate as a prosecution witness. Despite George's adamant denials of any involvement in the crime, the case proceeded to trial in August 2015. However, the defense came prepared. George's lawyer wasted no time in attacking Stevens' credibility, portraying him as an unreliable witness. The defense described his testimony as an elaborate fabrication, a desperate attempt by a repeat offender to shift the blame onto an innocent man. Under cross-examination, Stevens wavered. He admitted to suffering from visual hallucinations and hearing voices in his head. He acknowledged his history of substance abuse and his dependency on alcohol. The defense capitalized on this, painting him as a man detached from reality, someone who could hardly differentiate between fact and fantasy. His credibility crumbled with each passing moment. The prosecution's main task was to convince the jury that the seemingly perfect George Tiafe was capable of a brutal crime. And the prosecution had much more evidence than just the words of a questionable witness. The trial lasted a full week, during which the jury heard testimony from nearly 40 witnesses and examined over 400 pieces of physical evidence. After extensive deliberation, the 12 jurors retreated behind closed doors to determine George Tiafe's fate. For 3 agonizing days, the tension in the courthouse was palpable. The weight of the case bore down on both families, each clinging to their own version of the truth. Finally, the verdict was read. George Tiafe guilty on all charges, conspiracy to commit murder and first-degree murder. The sentence was unequivocal and final, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Neil Stevens, the man who had physically carried out George's plan, had also faced the weight of the justice system. Though his role was different, his punishment was equally severe, life imprisonment with a minimum of 42 years behind bars.